I never thought I would return from serving my country to find my front yard completely dead, a stack of violation notices from the HOA taped to my front door, and a bill for over $8,000 waiting in my mailbox. My name is Frank Yardley, and I had just completed a 9-month deployment to Kuwait with the United States Army. I am a staff sergeant with the 82nd Airborne Division, and this was my third deployment since buying my house in Riverside Meadows, a planned community just outside Charlotte, North Carolina. The neighborhood looked perfect when I bought the place 4 years ago. The streets were clean, the houses were well maintained, and the community amenities included a pool, tennis courts, and walking trails. What I did not know was that the HOA board was run by a woman named Brenda Hutchins, a 52-year-old self-appointed neighborhood watchdog who treated the community covenants like they were federal law. Before I deployed, I had taken every precaution. I met with my neighbor, Tom, who agreed to keep an eye on the place. I set up my sprinkler system on an automatic timer that would water my lawn 3 times a week during the early morning hours. I paid my HOA dues 6 months in advance. I even sent an email to the HOA board informing them that I would be deployed and providing Tom's contact information in case of emergencies. Everything was handled, or so I thought. The flight back from Kuwait was long and exhausting. 23 hours of travel, including layovers in Germany and Philadelphia, left me drained and desperate for my own bed. When the taxi finally pulled onto my street at around 9 in the evening, I noticed immediately that something was wrong. Even in the dim streetlight, I could see that my lawn was brown and dead. The flower beds that had been blooming with azaleas and daylilies were nothing but dried stalks. The small magnolia tree I had planted in the front yard looked like it might not survive. I paid the driver and dragged my duffel bags up to the front porch. That was when I saw the notices. There were at least a dozen of them, layered one on top of another, each one printed on the official HOA letterhead with Brenda Hutchins' name at the bottom. I ripped them down and unlocked my door, stepping into a house that smelled stale and felt empty. I dropped my bags and started reading through the notices. The first one was dated just 2 weeks after I had left for deployment. It was a courtesy warning about lawn maintenance, stating that my grass was beginning to show signs of inadequate watering and that I needed to address the issue within 7 days. The second notice, dated 1 week later, was a formal violation notice with a $50 fine attached. The third notice came another week after that, with the fine increased to $100. They continued like that, escalating every single week, with the fines growing larger and the language becoming more threatening. I felt my blood pressure rising as I read through them. The most recent notice, dated just 3 days before my return, informed me that my total fines had reached $8,300 and that the HOA was prepared to place a lien on my property if payment was not received within 30 days. At the bottom of this notice, Brenda had handwritten a note in red ink that said, "Failure to maintain community standards is unacceptable regardless of personal circumstances." I sat down on my couch and tried to process what I was reading. My sprinkler system should have been running the entire time I was gone. I had tested it multiple times before leaving, and it was working perfectly. Something must have gone wrong, but even so, I had notified the HOA that I was being deployed. I had provided a contact for emergencies. Surely they should have tried to reach out before letting the fines accumulate to this absurd amount. I was too tired to deal with it that night. I took a shower, ate some crackers from my pantry since I had no fresh food, and collapsed into bed. The next morning, I woke up early out of habit and went outside to inspect my sprinkler system. What I found made my hands clench into fists. The main water valve that controlled the sprinkler system had been manually shut off. Not only that, but someone had attached a small padlock to the valve housing to prevent it from being turned back on. There was a tag hanging from the padlock with the HOA logo printed on it and a note that read, "Water usage violation. Contact HOA office for restoration." I stood there in my dead yard, staring at that padlock, and felt a rage building inside me that I had not experienced since my first deployment. Someone from the HOA had come onto my property, shut off my sprinklers, locked them, and then proceeded to fine me for the consequences of their own actions. And I was willing to bet every dollar in my bank account that someone was Brenda Hutchins. I went back inside and found the contact information for the HOA management office. They opened at 9 in the morning, so I had a couple of hours to wait. I used that time to walk through the neighborhood and calm myself down. The morning air was cool and pleasant, and I saw several of my neighbors out walking their dogs or getting their newspapers. A few of them waved and welcomed me home. One older gentleman named Richard stopped to shake my hand and thank me for my service. Nobody mentioned my lawn. At 9 sharp, I called the HOA office. A woman answered with a chipper voice. Riverside Meadows Homeowners Association, this is Jessica speaking. How can I help you? This is Frank Yardley at 847 Willow Creek Drive. I just returned from a military deployment and found that my sprinkler system has been deliberately shut off and locked, and I have over $8,000 in fines. I need to speak with someone about this immediately. There was a pause on the other end. Let me transfer you to Mrs. Hutchins. She handles all violation matters. Before I could respond, I was put on hold. Elevator music played for about 2 minutes before a sharp nasal voice came on the line. This is Brenda Hutchins, HOA Board President. Mr. Yardley, is it? Yes, I need an explanation for why my sprinkler system was shut off and locked while I was deployed overseas. Mr. Yardley, your water usage was well above the community average for 3 consecutive billing cycles. Per Section 12.4 of the Community Covenants, excessive water usage that does not result in maintained landscaping is considered wasteful and is subject to intervention by the HOA Board. My water usage was high because my sprinklers were running to keep my lawn alive while I was serving my country, and instead of contacting me or my designated neighbor, you shut off my water and let my yard die, and then you fined me for it. Mr. Yardley, I do not appreciate your tone. The covenants are very clear. Every homeowner is responsible for maintaining their property to community standards. Your yard was an eyesore for months, and we received multiple complaints from your neighbors. You received complaints because you shut off my sprinklers. Before that, my yard was fine. That is your interpretation. The fact remains that you violated multiple sections of the community covenants, and the fines are valid and enforceable. You have 30 days to pay, or we will proceed with placing a lien on your property. I took a deep breath and tried to keep my voice level. Mrs. Hutchins, I sent an email to the HOA board before I deployed. I notified you that I would be overseas and provided contact information for someone who could handle emergencies. Did you receive that email? I receive dozens of emails every day, Mr. Yardley. I cannot be expected to remember every single communication. So you did receive it. I'm saying that even if I did, it does not change your responsibility to maintain your property. Military service is not an excuse for violating community standards. That was the moment I knew I was going to sue her. Not just the HOA, but her personally if I could manage it. The casual dismissiveness in her voice, the complete lack of empathy or basic human decency, and the sheer audacity of shutting off my sprinklers and then fining me for the results pushed me over the edge. Mrs. Hutchins, I want that lock removed from my sprinkler system today, and I will not be paying a single dollar of these fines. You can expect to hear from my attorney. Mr. Yardley, threatening legal action will not change the facts of the situation. The lock will be removed once you pay a $250 service restoration fee and agree in writing to maintain proper water usage going forward. Good day. She hung up on me. I stood in my kitchen, holding my phone, and had to resist the urge to throw it across the room. Instead, I took several deep breaths, counted to 10, and started making a plan. I needed documentation of everything. I needed a lawyer who understood both HOA law and military protections, and I needed to get my sprinklers turned back on before any more damage occurred to my property. First, I went to my computer and pulled up the email I had sent to the HOA board before deploying. I printed out multiple copies, including the delivery receipt showing that it had been opened and read. Then I took my phone outside and photographed everything. The dead lawn, the dried-out flower beds, the struggling magnolia tree, the locked sprinkler valve with the HOA tag, and every single violation notice that had been taped to my door. I documented everything with timestamps and multiple angles. Next, I walked over to Tom's house. He was working in his garage when I arrived, and his face lit up when he saw me. "Frank, you are back! Man, it's good to see you." We shook hands and caught up for a few minutes before I brought up the situation with my lawn. Tom's expression darkened. I tried to tell them, Frank. I really did. About a month after you left, I noticed your grass was looking brown, so I went to check your sprinklers. That was when I saw they had put that lock on it. I went straight to the HOA office and talked to Brenda myself. I told her you were deployed, that you had set everything up properly, and that it was not right to lock your sprinklers and let your yard die. What did she say? She said that you had been using excessive water and that the HOA had the authority to shut it off. I argued with her for 20 minutes, but she would not budge. I even called the management company and tried to go over her head, but they said Brenda was acting within her authority as board president. I am really sorry, man. I felt like I let you down. You did not let me down. Tom, you did everything you could. Did you keep any records of your conversations with them? I have a couple of emails. Let me forward them to you. Tom pulled out his phone and sent me the email chain right there. It showed exactly what he had described, multiple attempts to get the HOA to restore my water service, with Brenda responding each time that the matter was closed and that I would need to address my violations before any services would be restored. This was perfect. It showed that the HOA had been notified multiple times that I was deployed, that my neighbor had tried to intervene on my behalf, and that Brenda had deliberately chosen to let the situation continue rather than show any flexibility or common sense. I thanked Tom and headed back home. My next call was to the North Carolina State Bar's lawyer referral service. I explained my situation to the intake person, and she gave me the names of 3 attorneys who specialized in HOA disputes and had experience with military service member protections. I called all 3 and left messages. While I waited for callbacks, I grabbed a pair of bolt cutters from my garage and went outside to cut the lock off my sprinkler valve. If the HOA wanted to charge me for that, they could add it to the bill I was never going to pay. The lock snapped easily, and I turned the water back on. The sprinklers sputtered to life, and I watched as water finally began to flow across my dead lawn. It was probably too late to save most of the grass, but at least I could prevent any further damage. One of the attorneys called me back around noon. His name was David Pritchard, and he sounded young but knowledgeable. I explained the entire situation to him, and he listened without interrupting. When I finished, he let out a low whistle. Mr. Yardley, this is one of the most egregious HOA violations I have heard in a while. You have several legal protections working in your favor here. First, the Service Members Civil Relief Act provides protections against default judgments and property liens while you are on active duty. Second, North Carolina law requires HOAs to act in good faith and provides remedies for homeowners when they do not. Third, if we can prove that Mrs. Hutchins acted maliciously or in bad faith, we may be able to pierce the corporate veil and hold her personally liable. Can you take my case? Absolutely. I need to review all of your documentation first, but based on what you have told me, I think we have a very strong case. I would recommend that we send a demand letter first, outlining the violations and giving them one chance to rescind the fines and compensate you for the property damage. If they refuse, we file suit in Superior Court for breach of contract, breach of fiduciary duty, violation of the Service Members Civil Relief Act, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. How much is this going to cost me? I work on contingency for HOA cases. I take 33% of any settlement or judgment plus costs. You do not pay anything unless we win. That was exactly what I needed to hear. We scheduled a meeting for the next day at his office in Charlotte, and I spent the rest of the afternoon compiling every piece of documentation I had. Email receipts, photos, violation notices, Tom's emails, my deployment orders, everything. The meeting with David went well. He reviewed all of my materials and confirmed that I had an extremely strong case. He was particularly interested in the fact that Brenda had personally shut off my sprinklers and then personally issued the violation notices. That pattern of behavior suggested personal animus rather than neutral enforcement of community rules. David drafted a detailed demand letter that afternoon. It outlined every legal violation the HOA had committed, cited the relevant laws and statutes, and demanded that all fines be immediately rescinded, that the HOA pay for the restoration of my landscaping, and that Brenda Hutchins issue a written apology. The letter gave them 10 business days to respond. We sent the letter via certified mail and email to both the HOA management company and to Brenda Hutchins personally. Then we waited. The response came exactly 9 days later, and it was not what I had hoped for. The HOA's attorney sent a terse letter stating that all of the fines had been properly assessed pursuant to the community covenants, that the HOA had acted within its authority to address water usage violations, and that they would not be rescinding any fines or providing any compensation. The letter concluded by stating that if I did not pay the outstanding fines within 30 days, they would proceed with placing a lien on my property as authorized by North Carolina law. David was not surprised. Most HOAs take this position initially. They assume homeowners will back down rather than go through the expense and hassle of litigation, but we have them dead to rights on the Service Members Civil Relief Act violation alone. Let's file suit. We filed the lawsuit in Mecklenburg County Superior Court 3 days later. The complaint was 37 pages long and detailed every single violation, every communication, and every dollar of damage. We sued the HOA for breach of contract and breach of fiduciary duty, and we named Brenda Hutchins individually for intentional infliction of emotional distress, trespass, and violation of the Service Members Civil Relief Act. We asked for compensatory damages of $50,000 to cover property restoration, replacement of dead plants and trees, emotional distress, and legal fees. We also asked for punitive damages in an amount to be determined by the jury. The process server delivered the complaint to Brenda at her home on a Thursday evening. According to the affidavit of service, she had answered the door in a bathrobe and had turned red in the face when she realized what she was being handed. The reaction in the neighborhood was immediate and intense. Apparently, news of the lawsuit spread quickly, and opinions were divided. Some of my neighbors thought I was doing the right thing and that Brenda had always been too aggressive in her enforcement of HOA rules. Others thought I was being a troublemaker and that I should just pay the fines and move on. A few people stopped by my house to express their support, and one neighbor even offered to testify on my behalf about how unreasonable Brenda had been over the years. The HOA held an emergency board meeting 1 week after being served. I was not invited, but Tom attended as a homeowner and recorded the proceedings on his phone. The audio quality was not great, but I could hear Brenda's voice clearly as she railed against me for daring to sue the HOA and for trying to undermine the community standards that she had worked so hard to maintain. "This is exactly the kind of entitled behavior that destroys neighborhoods," she said on the recording. "Frank Yardley thinks that just because he was in the military, he should get special treatment and not have to follow the same rules as everyone else. Well, I have news for him. The covenants apply to everyone equally, and we will fight this lawsuit with everything we have." One of the other board members, a man named Greg, tried to interject. "Brenda, maybe we should consider settling this. The attorney fees alone are going to cost us more than the $50,000 he is asking for, and frankly, I think we made a mistake. The guy was deployed overseas. We should have worked with him." "Absolutely not," Brenda snapped. "If we give in now, every homeowner in this community will think they can violate the rules and just threaten to sue when they get caught. We are not settling." The board voted 3-2 not to pursue settlement negotiations. Brenda had 2 allies on the board who always voted with her, and the 2 dissenting members were overruled. David was pleased when I played him the recording. This is going to hurt them at trial. It shows that Brenda is acting out of personal pride rather than the best interests of the community. And that line about entitled behavior is going to sound terrible to a jury when they find out you were serving overseas. The discovery phase of the lawsuit was extensive. David subpoenaed all of the HOA's records related to my property, all communications between board members about my case, all water usage records for the community, and all other violation cases from the past 3 years. What we found was damning. First, my water usage had been high, but it was not the highest in the community. 3 other homes had used more water than I had during the same period, and none of them had been fined or had their sprinklers shut off. Second, the HOA covenants did not actually authorize the board to shut off water to a homeowner's sprinkler system. That provision had been added to the rules and regulations by Brenda herself without a vote of the full community. Third, there was an email chain between Brenda and the management company where the management company specifically told her that shutting off my sprinklers while I was deployed could expose the HOA to legal liability, and Brenda had responded that she did not care and was going to do it anyway. That last piece of evidence was gold. It showed that Brenda had been specifically warned about the legal consequences of her actions and had proceeded anyway. That was going to make it much easier to hold her personally liable. We also deposed Brenda herself. The deposition took place in David's conference room, and I was allowed to be present. Brenda showed up in a business suit with her own attorney, a tired-looking man named Richard Moss, who seemed like he knew his client was in serious trouble. David was relentless during the deposition. He walked Brenda through every decision she had made, every communication she had received, and every opportunity she had to handle the situation differently. She was defensive and combative from the start, insisting that she had done nothing wrong and that she was simply enforcing the rules. Mrs. Hutchins, you received an email from Mr. Yardley before he deployed, correct? I received many emails. I do not recall that specific one. Let me refresh your recollection. David slid a copy of my email across the table. This email is dated March 15th of last year. It states clearly that Mr. Yardley is being deployed overseas with the Army, that he has set his sprinklers on an automatic timer, and that he is providing contact information for his neighbor in case of emergencies. Do you recall receiving this email now? Brenda glanced at the email and shrugged. I may have received it. That does not change his obligation to maintain his property. Did you try to contact the neighbor, Tom Morrison, at any point before shutting off Mr. Yardley's sprinklers? No. Why not? I did not feel it was necessary. The covenants are clear. But Mr. Morrison came to you after you shut off the sprinklers, did he not? Yes. And he told you that Mr. Yardley was deployed overseas and asked you to turn the water back on, correct? He may have said something to that effect. And you refused. I told him that Mr. Yardley needed to address his violations. How was Mr. Yardley supposed to address his violations while he was in Kuwait? That's not my concern. David paused and let that answer hang in the air. Even Brenda's own attorney winced. Mrs. Hutchins, are you aware of the Service Member Civil Relief Act? Vaguely. Did you research whether that act applied to Mr. Yardley's situation before you shut off his sprinklers and started issuing fines? No. Did you consult with an attorney before taking those actions? No. Did you inform the other board members before taking those actions? I did not feel it was necessary. As board president, I have the authority to enforce the covenants. David went on like that for 3 hours. By the end, Brenda was visibly frustrated and angry, and her attorney looked like he wanted to be anywhere else. The deposition transcript was going to be devastating at trial. We also deposed the management company representative who confirmed that they had warned Brenda multiple times about potential legal issues and that she had ignored those warnings. We deposed Tom, who testified about his attempts to get the water turned back on. And we deposed 2 other homeowners who had received violations from Brenda over the years and described her as aggressive, unreasonable, and unwilling to listen to explanations or mitigating circumstances. As we got closer to the trial date, the HOA's insurance company got involved. Apparently, the HOA had liability insurance that covered legal defense costs and potential judgments, but the insurance company had a clause that excluded coverage for willful or malicious acts by board members. After reviewing the evidence, the insurance company informed the HOA that they would defend the breach of contract claims, but would not cover any personal liability claims against Brenda. That meant if we won any judgment against Brenda personally, she would have to pay it out of her own pocket. Her attorney approached David about settling her personal liability, but David refused. We were going to trial. The trial began on a Tuesday morning in late September. Judge Patricia Reeves presided, a no-nonsense woman in her early 60s with a reputation for being tough but fair. The jury consisted of 7 women and 5 men, ranging in age from mid-20s to early 70s. 2 of the jurors were veterans themselves, which David had specifically tried to get during jury selection. David's opening statement was powerful. He laid out the entire timeline, from my notification to the HOA before deploying, to Brenda's decision to shut off my sprinklers, to the accumulation of over $8,000 in fines, to my return home to find my property destroyed. He emphasized that I had done everything right, that I had followed the rules, and that Brenda had punished me anyway, simply because she could. The HOA's attorney, Richard Moss, tried to argue in his opening statement that the HOA had a duty to enforce the covenants equally, and that my military service, while commendable, did not exempt me from those rules. It was a weak argument, and I could tell from the jurors' faces that they were not buying it. We put on our case over 3 days. David called me to the stand first. I testified about my deployment, about the precautions I had taken before leaving, about my attempts to resolve the situation when I returned, and about the impact this had on me both financially and emotionally. I kept my testimony factual and straightforward, and I made sure to maintain eye contact with the jurors. The HOA's attorney tried to make me out to be irresponsible during cross-examination, asking why I had not hired a property management company to maintain my yard while I was gone. I pointed out that I had set up an automatic sprinkler system specifically to avoid needing to hire someone, and that the system had been deliberately sabotaged by the HOA. That shut down that line of questioning pretty quickly. David called Tom to the stand next. Tom testified about finding the locked sprinkler valve and about his conversations with Brenda. He was earnest and likable, and the jury clearly believed him. Then, we called the management company representative, who testified about warning Brenda that her actions could create legal liability. That testimony established that Brenda had been told she was doing something wrong and had done it anyway. Finally, we played excerpts from Brenda's deposition. Hearing her admit that she had never tried to contact my designated neighbor, that she had refused to turn the water back on even after being told I was deployed, and that she had not consulted an attorney or researched the legal implications of her actions was devastating. Several jurors shook their heads in disbelief. The HOA put on a weak defense. Their only real witness was Brenda herself, and she was a disaster on the stand. David cross-examined her mercilessly, getting her to admit that other homeowners had used more water without being punished, that she had added rules to the covenants without proper authorization, and that she had acted against the advice of the management company. At one point, David asked her why she thought it was appropriate to fine a deployed service member over $8,000 for a problem she had created. Brenda responded, "I was just doing my job." "Your job is to serve the community, is it not?" David asked. "Yes." "And you thought serving the community meant destroying a soldier's property while he was overseas defending our country?" Brenda did not have a good answer for that. Closing arguments took place on a Friday afternoon. David gave a passionate summation, arguing that the HOA and Brenda had violated my rights, destroyed my property, and showed a callous disregard for both the law and basic human decency. He asked the jury to send a message that this kind of behavior would not be tolerated. Richard Moss tried his best in his closing argument, but he did not have much to work with. He essentially asked the jury to find that the HOA had made some mistakes but had acted in good faith. It was not convincing. The jury deliberated for about 4 hours before reaching a verdict. Judge Reeves brought everyone back into the courtroom and asked the jury foreperson, a woman in her 50s, to read the verdict. In the matter of Frank Yardley versus Riverside Meadows Homeowners Association and Brenda Hutchins, we, the jury, find in favor of the plaintiff on all counts. I felt a wave of relief wash over me. David squeezed my shoulder. The foreperson continued reading. We award the plaintiff compensatory damages in the amount of $47,500. We award the plaintiff punitive damages against defendant Brenda Hutchins in the amount of $100,000. I heard Brenda gasp behind me. $100,000 in punitive damages meant the jury had been genuinely offended by her behavior. Combined with the compensatory damages, the total judgment was $147,500. Judge Reeves thanked the jury and dismissed them. Then she turned to the parties. The court finds that Mrs. Hutchins acted willfully and maliciously in violating Mr. Yardley's rights under the Service Member Civil Relief Act. The court further finds that the HOA failed in its fiduciary duty to act in the best interests of the community. The judgment will be entered as read. She banged her gavel, and it was over. David and I walked out of the courthouse into the late afternoon sunshine. I felt like a weight had been lifted off my shoulders. We did it, I said. You did it, David replied. You stood up for yourself when a lot of people would have just paid the fines and moved on. You should be proud. The news of the verdict spread quickly through Riverside Meadows. Within a week, Brenda resigned from the HOA board. 2 months later, she and her husband quietly listed their house for sale and moved out of the neighborhood. I heard through the grapevine that they had to take out a second mortgage to pay the judgment. The HOA paid their portion of the judgment within 30 days, as required by law. The money allowed me to completely restore my landscaping. I hired a professional company that ripped out all the dead grass, put down new sod, replanted the flower beds with fresh azaleas and daylilies, and treated my magnolia tree, which fortunately survived. My yard looked better than it ever had before. More importantly, the lawsuit prompted a complete overhaul of the HOA's governing documents and procedures. The board voted to remove all of the unauthorized rules that Brenda had added over the years. They established clear procedures for handling violations, including mandatory notification periods and opportunities for homeowners to respond before fines were assessed. They created a hardship exemption policy for deployed military members, hospitalized homeowners, and other situations where someone genuinely could not maintain their property through no fault of their own. Several of my neighbors told me that I had done the entire community a favor by standing up to Brenda. One woman told me that Brenda had been terrorizing the neighborhood for years and that nobody had been willing to challenge her. Another neighbor said that property values had actually increased after Brenda left because people were no longer afraid to live in a community run by a petty tyrant. The new HOA board was much more reasonable. They elected Greg, the board member who had wanted to settle my lawsuit, as the new president. He reached out to me personally to apologize for what had happened and to thank me for my service. He also asked if I would be willing to serve on the board myself, but I politely declined. I'd had enough of HOA politics to last a lifetime. As for Brenda, I never saw her again after the trial. I heard that she and her husband moved to a different neighborhood on the other side of Charlotte. Part of me felt a little bad about the judgment forcing her to essentially uproot her life. But then I would remember coming home from deployment to find my property destroyed and a stack of threatening notices on my door, and any sympathy would evaporate. She had been given multiple opportunities to do the right thing, and she had chosen vindictiveness instead. The most satisfying moment came about 6 months after the trial. I was working in my front yard, planting some new bushes along the driveway, when a car pulled up and a young man in his 20s got out. He introduced himself as Marcus, a recently returned veteran who lived a few streets over. "Ati, I heard about what you did with the HOA," he said. "I just wanted to thank you. I'm getting ready to deploy next month, and I was really worried about what would happen to my place while I am gone. But now the HOA has all these new policies protecting deployed service members, and I feel a lot better about leaving. That made everything worth it. The lawsuit had not just been about getting justice for myself. It had been about making sure that no other service member in my community would have to go through what I went through." I finished planting my bushes and stood back to admire my work. My lawn was green and lush. My flower beds were blooming with color. My magnolia tree had come back stronger than ever and was covered in glossy leaves. Everything looked perfect. I thought about the past year and everything I had been through. The deployment, the return home to disaster, the stress of the lawsuit, the trial, the victory. It had been exhausting and frustrating and infuriating. But in the end, justice had prevailed. The law had protected me the way it was supposed to. The jury had seen through Brenda's excuses and had held her accountable for her actions, and my community was now a better place because of it. I walked back to my house, grabbed a cold beer from the refrigerator, and sat on my front porch, looking out at my restored yard as the sun began to set. My phone buzzed with a text message from David. He had just received confirmation that Brenda had paid her portion of the judgment in full. The case was completely closed. I smiled and raised my beer in a silent toast. To justice, to accountability, and to never letting petty tyrants get away with abusing their power. I had deployed to defend the freedoms we all enjoyed, and I had come home to fight for those same freedoms against someone who thought rules gave her the right to destroy other people's lives. Tom walked over from his house and joined me on the porch. I handed him a beer, and we sat in comfortable silence for a while. watching the neighborhood come alive with people walking their dogs and kids riding bikes in the street. "You know," Tom said eventually, "I'm really glad you decided to fight this. A lot of guys would have just paid the fines and let it go." "I could not do that," I said. "It was not about the money. It was about the principle. If Brenda could do this to me, she could do it to anyone. Someone had to stop her." "Well, you definitely did that. The whole neighborhood is different now. People are not afraid anymore." We clinked our beer bottles together and watched as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Somewhere in the distance, I heard the automatic sprinklers of several houses kick on, watering lawns and keeping everything green and alive. It was a sound that I would never take for granted again. The next few months passed peacefully. I settled back into civilian life, returned to my job as a logistics coordinator for a shipping company, and enjoyed the simple pleasure of living in a well-maintained home in a community that finally functioned the way it was supposed to. The new HOA board was responsive and reasonable. When violations occurred, they were handled with common sense and proportionality. The reign of terror was over. I ran into Richard Moss, the HOA's attorney, at a coffee shop one morning. He recognized me and came over to shake my hand. "No hard feelings, I hope," he said. "I was just doing my job representing my client." "No hard feelings," I replied. "You were stuck with a bad case. I get it." "Between you and me," he said quietly, "I tried to get Brenda to settle multiple times. She would not listen. That woman was her own worst enemy." "Sounds about right." He laughed and wished me well before leaving. It was a strange encounter, but it reminded me that not everyone involved in the situation had been acting out of malice. Some people were just doing their jobs even when their clients were in the wrong. A year after the trial, the local newspaper ran a story about HOA reform in North Carolina. My case was mentioned prominently as an example of HOA overreach and the importance of legal protections for homeowners. The article quoted several state legislators who were proposing new laws to increase oversight of HOAs and to provide additional protections for military service members. David called me when the article came out, excited that our case was having an impact beyond just our community. "You should be proud, Frank," he said. "You have probably helped thousands of people without even knowing it." That felt good. I had not set out to be any kind of activist or crusader. I just wanted to fix an injustice that had been done to me. But if my experience could help prevent similar injustices from happening to others, then all the stress and effort had been worthwhile. 2 years after the trial, I received a letter from the North Carolina Bar Association. They were hosting an event on homeowner rights and HOA law, and they wanted me to speak on a panel about my experience. I was hesitant at first, not being much of a public speaker, but David encouraged me to do it. The event was held at a hotel conference center in Raleigh and was attended by about 200 people, including homeowners, attorneys, and HOA board members. I sat on a panel with David, a state legislator, and a representative from a homeowner advocacy group. We each told our stories and answered questions from the audience. When it was my turn to speak, I told the entire story from start to finish. The deployment, the locked sprinklers, the fines, the lawsuit, the trial, the verdict. I talked about how violated I felt when I came home to find my property destroyed and how angry I was at the injustice of being punished for something that was not my fault. I also talked about the importance of standing up for yourself and not letting bullies win, whether those bullies are individuals or institutions. The audience was engaged and asked thoughtful questions. Several people came up to me afterward to share their own HOA horror stories. A few people thanked me for fighting back and said my case had inspired them to challenge unfair violations they had received. One older veteran shook my hand with tears in his eyes and said he had gone through something similar 30 years ago but had not known he could fight it. Those conversations made me realize that HOA abuse was far more common than I had thought. There were Brenda Hutchinses all over the country, petty tyrants on power trips who used community covenants as weapons against their neighbors. Most people just paid the fines or accepted the violations because they did not know they had options, or because they were afraid of the cost and hassle of fighting back. I hoped my story would encourage more people to stand up for themselves. Not everyone would need to file a lawsuit, but everyone deserved to know their rights and to demand that their HOA act reasonably and in good faith. Life in Riverside Meadows continued to improve. The new HOA board actually listened to homeowners and made decisions based on what was best for the community, rather than on rigid adherence to arbitrary rules. They repainted the community pool, fixed the tennis courts, and added new playground equipment. They organized neighborhood events like block parties and holiday decorations contests. The community felt like an actual community rather than a police state. I became friendly with several of my neighbors who I had barely known before the lawsuit. We would have barbecues in each other's backyards, help each other with yard work, and watch each other's houses when someone went on vacation. It was the kind of neighborhood I had hoped for when I bought the house all those years ago. Greg, the new HOA president, did an excellent job. He ran the board with transparency and fairness, and he made a point of reaching out to homeowners before violations were issued to see if there were extenuating circumstances or if the HOA could help in some way. Under his leadership, the number of violations issued dropped by more than 70%, not because people were violating the rules more often, but because most issues were resolved through communication rather than fines. One day, about 3 years after the trial, I was at the grocery store when I saw Brenda in the produce section. We made eye contact for a brief moment. She looked older and tired. I nodded politely, and she quickly turned away and walked down another aisle. I did not feel any particular emotion seeing her. No anger, no satisfaction, just a vague sense of sadness that someone could have made such a mess of their life over something so petty. I grabbed my groceries and headed home. That evening, I sat on my porch with Tom, just like we had done so many times before. We talked about sports and work and nothing in particular. At one point, Tom asked me if I had any regrets about the lawsuit. No, I said without hesitation. It was the right thing to do, not just for me but for everyone who lives here. Brenda needed to be stopped, and I'm glad I was the one who did it. You know what I think? Tom said. I think you are a hero, not just for serving in the army, but for standing up to her. A lot of people would have just taken it and moved on. You actually did something about it. I do not know about hero, I said, but I appreciate that. We sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the neighborhood. Kids were playing in the street. Dogs were being walked. Sprinklers were running on green lawns. Everything was exactly as it should be. My phone buzzed with an email notification. It was from David, forwarding me an article about a new HOA lawsuit in Florida where a deployed service member was being fined for having a too small American flag in his yard. The homeowner's attorney had cited my case in his complaint as precedent for why the HOA's actions violated the Service Member Civil Relief Act. I smiled and showed the email to Tom. Looks like the fight continues, I said. Yeah, but at least now people know they can fight back, Tom replied. You showed them how. That night, as I was getting ready for bed, I thought about everything that had happened since I came home from Kuwait. The shock and anger of discovering my destroyed property, the frustration of dealing with Brenda's stubbornness, the stress of the lawsuit and trial, the satisfaction of the verdict, the peace of the years that followed. It had been a difficult journey, but it had been worth it. I had stood up for myself when it would have been easier to back down. I had fought for justice when I could have just accepted injustice, and I had made a difference not just for myself, but for my community and potentially for countless others around the country who were facing similar situations. I looked out my bedroom window at my front yard, illuminated by the streetlights. The grass was thick and green. The flower beds were full of blooming plants. The magnolia tree stood tall and strong. Everything I had fought for was right there, tangible proof that standing up to bullies and fighting for what is right really does matter. As I lay in bed that night, I felt a sense of peace and contentment that I had not felt in years. My house was mine, truly mine, free from the threat of liens or fines or arbitrary enforcement of unreasonable rules. My community was a better place to live, and I had the satisfaction of knowing that when I was pushed, I pushed back, and I won. Justice had been served. The HOA Karren, who thought she could destroy my property while I was deployed and then fine me for it, had learned a very expensive lesson. And every dollar of that $147,500 judgment was a reminder that power without accountability is tyranny, and tyranny, eventually, always falls. I closed my eyes and slept peacefully, knowing that I had done the right thing and that the fight had been worth it. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new adventures, but tonight I could rest easy knowing that this particular battle had been won decisively and completely. The sprinklers outside clicked on right on schedule, watering my lawn just like they were supposed to, keeping everything alive and green and healthy. It was a simple thing, really, but after everything I had been through, it felt like a small miracle. Nobody would ever shut off my sprinklers again. Nobody would ever find me for problems they created. Nobody would ever treat me like I did not matter just because I was serving my country overseas. Those days were over. I had made sure of it, and that, more than anything else, was worth celebrating.